Chapter 9 of The Power of Israel in the United States by James Petras. Israel's War with Iran, the Coming Mideast Conflagration. Introduction. Israel's political and military leadership have repeatedly and openly declared their preparation to militarily attack Iran in the immediate future. Their influential supporters in the U.S. have made Israel's war policy the #1 priority in their effort to secure presidential and congressional backing. Their arguments put forth by the Israeli government and echoed by their followers in the U.S. regarding Iran's nuclear threat are without substance or fact and have aroused opposition and misgivings throughout the world, among European governments, international agencies, among most U.S. military leaders and the public, the world oil industry, and even among sectors of the Bush administration. An Israeli air and commando attack on Iran will have catastrophic military consequences for U.S. forces, cause severe loss of human life in Iraq, and most likely ignite political and military violence against pro-U.S. Arab Muslim regimes such as Saudi Arabia and Egypt, perhaps leading to their overthrow. Without a doubt, Israeli war preparations are the greatest immediate threat to world peace and political stability. Israel's war preparations. Never has an imminent war been so loudly and publicly advertised as Israel's intended military aggression against Iran. When the Israeli military chief of staff, Daniel Halutz, was asked how far Israel was ready to go to stop Iran's nuclear energy program, he said, quote, 2,000 meters, the distance of an air assault. More specifically, Israeli military sources revealed that Sharon had ordered Israel's armed forces to prepare for airstrikes on uranium enrichment sites in Iran. According to the London Times, the order to prepare for attack went through the Israeli Defense Ministry to the Chief of Staff. During the first week in December, sources inside the Special Forces Command confirmed that G-readiness, the highest state for an operation, was announced. On December 9, 2005, Israeli Minister of Defense Shaul Mofaz affirmed that, in view of Tehran's nuclear plans, Tel Aviv should not count on diplomatic negotiations but prepare other solutions. In early December, Aaron Zovi Farkash, the Israeli military intelligence chief, told the Israeli parliament, Knesset, that if by the end of March the international community is unable to refer the Iranian issue to the United Nations Security Council, then we can say that the international effort has run its course. If international diplomatic negotiations fail to comply with Israel's timeline, Israel will unilaterally, militarily attack Iran. Benjamin Netanyahu, leader of the Likud party and then candidate for prime minister, stated that if Sharon did not act against Iran, quote, then I will form the new Israeli government after the March 2006 elections. We'll do what we did in the past against Saddam's reactor. In June 1981, Israel bombed the US-IRAQ nuclear reactor in Iran. Even the pro-labor newspaper, Haaretz, while disagreeing with the time and place of Netanyahu's pronouncements, agreed with its substance. Haaretz criticized those who publicly recommend an Israeli military option because it presents Israel as pushing, via powerful pro-Israel organizations in the U.S., the United States into a major war. However, Haaretz added, Israel must go about making its preparations quietly and securely, not at election rallies. Haaretz's position, like that of the Labor Party, was that Israel should not advocate war against Iran before multilateral negotiations were over and the International Atomic Energy Agency made a decision. In other words, the Israeli debate among the elite had not been over whether to go to war, but over the place to discuss war plans and the timing to launch war. Implicitly, Haaretz recognized the role played by pro-Israeli organizations in pushing the U.S. into the Iraq War, finding it advisable to perhaps insert a word of caution resulting from increased U.S. opposition to the activities of the Israel First campaigners in Congress. Israel's war deadline. All top Israeli officials pronounced the end of March 2006 as the deadline for launching a military assault on Iran. The thinking behind this date was to heighten the pressure on the U.S. to force the sanctions issue in the Security Council. The tactic was to blackmail Washington with the war or else threat into pressuring Europe, namely Great Britain, France, Germany, and Russia, into approving sanctions against Iran. Israel knows that its acts of war will endanger thousands of American soldiers in Iraq, and it knows that Washington and Europe cannot afford a third war at this time. The end of March date also coincided with the IAEA report to the UN on Iran's nuclear energy program. Israeli policymakers believed that their threats might influence the report, or at least force the kind of ambiguities that could then be exploited by its overseas supporters to promote Security Council sanctions or justify Israeli military action. Fixing a March date also intensified the political activities of the pro-Israel organizations in the United States. The major pro-Israel lobbies lined up a majority in the U.S. Congress and Senate to push for the UN Security Council to implement economic sanctions against Iran or, failing that, endorse Israeli defensive action. Thousands of pro-Israel national, local, and community groups and individuals have been mobilized to promote the Israeli agenda via the mass media and visits to U.S. congressional representatives. The war agenda also plays on exploiting the tactical disputes among the civilian militarists within the White House, between Cheney, Bolton, and Abrams on one side, and Rice and Rumsfeld on the other. The Cheney line has always supported an Israeli military attack, while Rice promotes the tactic of forced failure of the European diplomatic route before taking decisive action. Rumsfeld, under tremendous pressure from practically all of the top professional military officials, fears that an Israeli war will further escalate U.S. military losses. The pro-Israel lobby would like to replace the ultra-militarist Rumsfeld with the ultra-militarist Senator Joseph Lieberman, an unconditional Israel First zealot. The war, of course, has not yet materialized, but the threat did increase the pressure from Washington on the Security Council to impose harsh economic sanctions on Iran. U.S.-Israeli disagreements on an Iran war. As Israel and the Jewish lobbies intensified their efforts to provoke a U.S. economic and military confrontation with Iran, disputes within the Washington establishment surfaced. The conflicts and mutual attacks extended throughout the state institutions and into the public discourse. Supporters and opponents of Israel's war policy represent powerful segments of state institutions and civil society. On the side of the Israeli war policy are practically all the major and most influential Jewish organizations, the pro-Israeli lobbies, their political action committees, a sector of the White House, a majority of subsidized congressional representatives and state, local, and party leaders. On the other side are sectors of the Pentagon, State Department, a minority of congressional members, a majority of public opinion, a minority of American Jews, Union of Reform Judaism, and the majority of active and retired military commanders who have served or are serving in Iraq. Most of the discussion and debate in the U.S. on Israel's war agenda has been dominated by the pro-Israeli organizations that transmit the Israeli state positions. The Jewish weekly newspaper, Forward, has reported a number of Israeli attacks on the Bush administration for not acting more aggressively on behalf of Israel's policy. According to Forward, Jerusalem is increasingly concerned that the Bush administration is not doing enough to block Tehran from acquiring nuclear weapons. Further stark differences occurred during the semi-annual strategic dialogue between Israeli and U.S. security officials, in which the Israelis opposed a U.S. push for regime change in Syria, fearing the emergence of a possibly more radical Islamic regime. The Israeli officials also criticized the U.S. for forcing Israel to agree to open the Rafah border crossing, upsetting their stranglehold on the economy in Gaza. Predictably, the biggest Jewish organization in the U.S., the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, CPM-AJO, immediately echoed the Israeli state line, as it has since its founding. Malcolm Hoenlein, president of the CPM-AJO, lambasted Washington for a, quote, failure of leadership on Iran and contracting the issue to Europe. He went on to attack the Bush administration for not following Israel's demands by delaying referring Iran to the UN Security Council for sanction. The leader of the CPM-AJO then turned on French, German, and British negotiators, accusing them of appeasement and weakness and of not having a game plan for decisive action. presumably for not following Israel's sanction or bomb them decisive action. The role of AIPAC, the CPM-AJO, and other pro-Israeli organizations as transmission belts for Israel's bellicose war plans was evident in their November 28, 2005 condemnation of the Bush administration's agreement to give Russia a chance to negotiate a plan under which Iran would be allowed to enrich uranium under international supervision to ensure that its enriched uranium would not be used for military purposes. AIPAC's rejection of the negotiations and demands for an immediate confrontation were based on the specious arguments that it would facilitate Iran's quest for nuclear weapons, an argument which flies in the face of all known intelligence data, including Israel's, which says Iran is at least 3 to 10 years away from even approaching nuclear weaponry. AIPAC's unconditional and uncritical transmission of Israeli demands and criticisms is usually clothed in the rhetoric of U.S. interests or security in order to manipulate U.S. policy. Accordingly, AIPAC chastised the Bush regime for endangering U.S. security. By relying on negotiations, AIPAC accused the Bush administration would be, quote, giving Iran yet another chance to manipulate the international community and, quote, pose a severe danger to the United States. Pushing the U.S. into a confrontation with Iran via economic sanctions and military attack has been a top priority for Israel and its supporters in the U.S. for more than a decade. AIPAC believes the Islamic Republic poses a grave threat to Israel's supremacy in the Middle East. In line with its policy of forcing a U.S. confrontation with Iran, AIPAC, the Israeli PAC's political action committees, and the CPM-AJO have successfully lined up a majority of congresspeople to challenge what they describe as the appeasement of Iran. According to the Jewish Times, if it comes down to a political battle, signs are that AIPAC could muster strong support in Congress to press the White House to demand sanctions on Iran. Representative Elena Ross-Lehtinen, Republican Florida, who has the dubious distinction of being a collaborator with Cuban exile terrorist groups and unconditional backer of Israel's war policy, is the chairwoman of the highly influential U.S. House of Representatives Middle East Subcommittee. From that platform, she has echoed the CPM-AJO line about European appeasement and arming the terrorist regime in Tehran. Ross-Lehtinen is the main sponsor of two bills that have been front and center for AIPAC in recent months: the Iran Freedom Support Act, which was approved by the House last month, April 2006, and the Palestinian Anti-Terrorism Act, which is expected to be passed in the near future. The Iran Freedom Support Act, H.R. 282, proposes to hold the current regime in Iran accountable for its threatening behavior and to support a transition to democracy in Iran. A similar bill was introduced by Senator Rick Santorum into the Senate in February 2005, which codifies existing sanctions, controls, and regulations in place against Iran, expands the list of entities that can be sanctioned under the Iran-Libya Sanction Act, and authorizes $10 million in assistance to pro-democracy groups opposed to the current Iranian regime. Interestingly, the Philadelphia Daily News reported on May 22, 2006 that Senator Rick Santorum tops Public Citizen's list of congressional receivers and lobbyists' funds during the 1998 to 2004 election cycle. Quote, maybe voters and reporters, the Philadelphia Daily News concluded, should start asking more questions about just what Santorum might have done in return for all that dough. The pro-Israel lobby's power, which includes AIPAC, the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations, the PACs, and hundreds of local formal and informal organizations, is magnified by their influence and hegemony over Congress, the mass media, financial institutions, pension funds, and fundamentalist Christian organizations. Within the executive branch, their influence in these institutions amplifies their power far beyond their number and direct control and representation in strategic public and private institutions, which itself is formidable. AIPAC's Progress and Policy Report for 2005, published on its website, lists among its accomplishments getting Congress to approve 100 pro-Israel legislative initiatives, $3 billion in direct aid, and more than $10 billion in guaranteed loans, transfer of the most advanced military technology to Israel's multi billion export arms corporations, and the lining up of a 410-1 vote in the House of Representatives committing the U.S. to Israel's security, as it is defined by Israel. The conflict between the Israeli elite and the Bush administration, to the extent that such appears to exist, has to be located in a broader context. Despite pro-Israeli attacks on U.S. policy for its weakness on Iran, Washington has moved as aggressively as circumstances permit. Facing European opposition to an immediate confrontation, as AIPAC and Israeli politicians demand, Washington supported European negotiations but imposed extremely limiting conditions, which were contrary to the terms of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which allows uranium enrichment for peaceful purposes. The European compromise of forcing Iran to turn over the enrichment process to a foreign country, Russia, was not only a violation of its sovereignty, but also a policy that no country using nuclear energy practices. Given this transparently unacceptable mandate, it is clear that Washington's support for negotiations was a propaganda device to provoke an Iranian rejection, and a means of securing Europe's support for a Security Council referral for international sanctions. Washington had absolutely no precedent to object to Russia's sale of defensive surface-to-air missiles to Iran, since it is standard in the arms export business. As for the ambassadorial meeting in Iraq, the U.S. has had great success in securing Iranian cooperation on stabilizing its Iraqi Shiite client regime. Iran has recognized the regime has signed trade agreements, supported the dubious elections, and provided the U.S. with intelligence against the Sunni resistance. Given their common interests in the region, it was logical for Washington to seek to bend Iran into further cooperation via diplomatic discussions. It is no surprise that the Zionist Organization of America, ZOA, invited the most bellicose of U.S. Middle East warmongers, UN Ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton, to be its keynote speaker at its annual awards dinner. The ZOA has loyally followed all the zigzags of Israeli policy since the foundation of the state. Despite the near unanimous support and widespread influence of the major Jewish organizations, 20% of American Jews do not support Israel in its conflict with the Palestinians. Even more significantly, 61% of Jews almost never talk about Israel or defend Israel in conversations with Goyim, non-Jews. Only 29% of Jews are active promoters of Israel. Even in Israel, the support fluctuates, as reported on Now with Boy Moyers. In late February 2002, a poll in Israel's largest paper, Yediot Ahronoth, found majority support for evacuating all settlements in Gaza, 57%, and some or all in the West Bank, 59%. As tensions rose during the last year, national polls found a growing number of Israelis in favor of transfer, the removal of Palestinians from the West Bank. According to a June 2003 survey by Martin Indyk, published in the journal Foreign Affairs, found Israeli public opinion polls consistently show strong majorities in favor of a full settlement freeze and of evacuation of outlying settlements as part of a peace process that provides Israel with security. As for the settlers themselves, a further poll taken by Peace Now indicated that nearly 80% of the settlers moved to the West Bank to improve their quality of life. Expensive homes, swimming pools, gardens, a quality made possible by the American taxpayer. It is important to note that the Israel First crowd represents less than a third of the Jewish community, and hence their claim to speak for all U.S. Jews is false and a misrepresentation. In fact, there is more opposition to Israel among Jews than there is in the U.S. Congress. Having said that, however, most Jewish critics of Israel are not influential in the big Jewish organizations and the Israel lobby. They are excluded from the mass media and mostly intimidated from speaking out, especially on Israel's war preparations against Iran. The minority Jewish critics cannot match the $5 to $8 million spent in buying congressional votes each year by the pro-Israel lobbies. Prior to the Israeli elections, Israel's Labor Party officials did not believe that Iran represented an immediate nuclear threat and felt that the Sharon government and the Likud war propaganda was an electoral ploy. According to Haaretz, Labor Party officials accused Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, Defense Minister Shaul Mofaz, and other defense officials of using the Iran issue in their election campaigns in an effort to divert public debate from social issues. In a message directed at the Israeli right, but equally applicable to AIPAC and the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations in the U.S., Labor member of the Knesset, Benjamin Ben Eliezer, rejected electoral warmongering. Quote, I hope the upcoming elections won't motivate the Prime Minister and Defense Minister to stray from government policy and place Israel on the front lines of confrontation with Iran. The nuclear issue is an international issue, and there is no reason for Israel to play a major role in it. Unfortunately, the Israel lobby made it a U.S. issue and put Washington on the front lines. Post-election, however, with the departure of Sharon from the scene and Olmert having assumed power with the new Kadima party, the war agenda is back on track. On May 10, 2006, the Israeli Yediot Internet headlined the program succinctly, Olmert to ask U.S. act against Iran. PM set to visit Washington in 2 weeks for summit with President Bush. Olmert to point to link between Tehran nuclear threat, Hamas terror, demand Americans move against Iran. Fabrication of Iran's nuclear threat. Israeli intelligence has determined that Iran has neither the enriched uranium nor the capability to produce an atomic weapon now or in the immediate future. In contrast to the hysterical claims publicized by the U.S. pro-Israel lobbies. Mohammed El-Baradei, head of the United Nations International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, which has inspected Iran for several years, has pointed out that the IAEA has found no proof that Iran is trying to construct nuclear weapons. He criticized Israeli and U.S. warplanes indirectly by warning that a military solution would be completely unproductive. At one point, in a clear move to defuse the issue of the future use of enriched uranium, Iran even opened the door for U.S. help in building a nuclear power plant. Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Hamid Reza Assefi, speaking at a press conference, stated, America can take part in the international bidding for the construction of Iran's nuclear power plant if they observe the basic standards and quality. Iran also plans to build several other nuclear power plants with foreign help. The Iranian call for foreign assistance is hardly the strategy of a country trying to conduct a covert atomic bomb program, especially one directed at involving one of its principal accusers, a state which has established as official policy its own willingness to use nuclear weapons, even against non-nuclear states. In April 2006, Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad announced that Iran had successfully enriched uranium. However, at its current level of development, there is still no factual basis for arguing that Iran represents a nuclear threat to Israel or to the U.S. forces in the Middle East, even though Iranian pursuit of nuclear weapons would indeed be logical, given the blatant threat it faces from other powers determined to, quote, transform the Middle East. Israel's war preparations and AIPAC's efforts to push the U.S. in the same direction based on falsified data or imminent threat is reminiscent of the fabricated evidence which was channeled to the White House through the Pentagon's Office of Special Plans, led by Abram Shulsky and directed by Douglas Feith and Paul Wolfowitz, both longtime supporters of the Likud party. Israel's war preparations are not over any present or future Iranian nuclear threat. The issue is over future enrichment of uranium, which is legal under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, as is its use in producing electrical power. Iran currently is only in the uranium enrichment phase. Scores of countries with nuclear reactors, by necessity, use enriched uranium. The Iranian decision to advance to processing enriched uranium is its sovereign right, as it is for all countries that possess nuclear reactors in Europe, Asia, and North America. Israel and AIPAC's resort to the vague formulation of Iran's potential nuclear capacity is so open-ended that it could apply to scores of countries with a minimum scientific infrastructure. Even as the scaremongering proceeds apace, Brazil announced it had inaugurated a uranium enrichment center capable of producing the kind of nuclear fuel that Iran wants to make, despite international pressure against it. There was no outcry against Brazil. The European quartet evaded the issue of whether or not Iran has atomic weapons or is manufacturing them, and focused instead on attacking Iran's capacity to produce nuclear energy, namely the production of enriched uranium. It raised a bogus issue by conflating enriched uranium production with a nuclear threat and nuclear potential with the danger of an imminent nuclear attack on Western countries, troops, and Israel. The Europeans, especially Great Britain, had two options in mind: to impose an Iranian acceptance of limits on its sovereignty, more specifically on its energy policy, and capacity to control the deadly air pollution of its major cities with cleaner sources of energy, or to force Iran to reject the arbitrary addendum to the Non-Proliferation Agreement and then to propagandize the rejection as an indication of Iran's evil intention to create atomic bombs and to target pro-Western countries. The Western media would echo the US and European government's position that Iran was responsible for the breakdown of negotiations. The Europeans would then convince their public that since reason failed, the only recourse was to follow the US to take the issue to the Security Council and approve international sanctions against Iran, where the US would then attempt to pressure Russia and China to vote in favor of sanctions or to abstain. However, it has become clear that neither country will agree, given the importance of the multi-billion-dollar oil, arms, nuclear, and trade deals between Iran and these two countries. Having tried and failed in the Security Council, the US and Israel are likely to move toward a military attack. An air attack on suspected Iranian nuclear facilities will entail the bombing of heavily populated as well as remote regions, leading to large-scale loss of life. Even a limited attack, bombing the Iranian Esfahan plant alone, could lead to a horrific level of damage. A simulation of RNEP, Robust Nuclear Earth Penetrator, used against the Esfahan nuclear facility in Iran using the software developed for the Pentagon showed that 3 million people would be killed by radiation within 2 weeks of the explosion, and 35 million people in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India would be exposed to increased levels of cancer-causing radiation. The principal result will be a massive escalation of war throughout the Middle East. Iran, a country of 70 million with several times the military forces that Iraq possesses and with highly motivated and committed military and paramilitary forces, can be expected to cross into Iraq. Iraqi Shiites sympathetic to or allied with Iran would most likely break their ties with Washington and go into combat. U.S. military bases, troops, and clients would be under tremendous attack. U.S. military casualties would multiply. All troop withdrawals plans would be disrupted. The Iraqization strategy would disintegrate as the U.S. loyal Shia armed forces would turn against their American officers. Beyond Iraq, there would likely be major military civilian uprisings in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, and Pakistan. The conflagration would spread beyond the Middle East as the US-Israel attack on an Islamic country would ignite mass protests throughout Asia. Most likely, new terrorist incidents would occur in Western Europe, North America, and Australia, and against US multinationals, wherever their operations might be located. A bitter, prolonged war would ensue, pitting 70 million unified Iranian nationals, millions of Muslims in Asia and Africa, against an isolated US accompanied by its increasingly reluctant European allies, facing mass popular protests at home. While the US effort to achieve sanctions at the UN appears to have failed, this does not mean that its efforts to impose sanctions on Iran has ceased. Stephen R. Weissman, writing in the New York Times on May 22, 2006, noted, "Prodded by the United States with threats of fines and lost business, 4 of the biggest European banks have started curbing their activities in Iran, even in the absence of a Security Council resolution imposing economic sanctions on Iran for its suspected nuclear weapons program." However, while the U.S. appears determined to pursue sanctions by other means than through the UN, sanctions on Iran will not work because its oil is a scarce and essential commodity. China, India, and other fast-growing Asian countries will balk at a boycott. Turkey and other Muslim countries will not cooperate. Numerous Western oil companies will work through intermediaries. The sanctions policy is predestined to failure. Its only result will be to raise the price of oil even higher. An Israeli or U.S. military attack will cause severe political instability and increase the risk to oil producers, shippers, and buyers, raising the price of oil to astronomical heights, likely over $100 a barrel, destabilizing the world economy and provoking a major world recession or worse. As for Israel, having failed in its attempt to precipitate a U.S. military attack on Iran at the end of March, in large part because of the losses in Iraq, Israel then decided to raise tensions through an invasion and mass civilian bombing of Gaza and Lebanon, especially aimed at destroying Hezbollah, Iran's ally, in the hope of provoking an Iranian military response. As for Israel, having failed in its attempt to precipitate a U.S. military attack on Iran at the end of March, in large part because of the losses in Iraq, Israel then decided to raise tensions through an invasion and mass civilian bombing of Gaza and Lebanon, especially aimed at destroying Hezbollah, Iran's ally, in the hope of provoking an Iranian military response. Conclusion: the only possible beneficiary of a U.S. or Israeli military attack on Iran or economic sanctions will be Israel. This will seem to eliminate a military adversary in the Middle East and consolidate its military supremacy in the Middle East. But even this outcome is problematic because it fails to take account of the fact that Iran's challenge to Israel is primarily political and does not lie in its non-existent nuclear potential. The first target of the millions of Muslims protesting Israeli aggression will be the Arab regimes closest to Israel. An Israeli attack would be a Pyrrhic victory if a predictable political conflagration unseats the rulers of Jordan, Egypt, Syria, and Saudi Arabia. The consequences would be even worse if the U.S. attacks: major oil wells burning, U.S. troops in Iraq surrounded, long-term relations with Arab regimes undermined, increased oil prices and troop casualties, inflaming domestic public opinion. An attack on Iran will not be a cleanly executed surgical strike. It will be a deep, jagged wound leading to gangrene. No doubt, AIPAC might celebrate, quote, another success for Israel in its yearly self-congratulatory report of missions accomplished. The Conference of Presidents of major Jewish organizations in America will thank their obedient and loyal congressional followers for approving the destruction of an anti-Semitic and anti-American nuclear threat to all of humanity or some similar rubbish. The big losers of a U.S.-Israeli military attack on Iran are the U.S. soldiers in Iraq and other Middle Eastern countries who will be killed and maimed, the U.S. public, which will pay in blood and bloated deficits, the oil companies, which will see their oil supplies disrupted, and their new multi-billion-dollar joint oil exploration contracts undermined, the Palestinians, who will suffer the consequence of greater repression and massive displacement, the Lebanese people, who will be forcibly entangled in a new border war, and the Europeans, who will face terrorist retaliations. Already, it seems fair to say the U.S. is suffering geopolitical repercussions from its unreasonable targeting of Iran, and in the eyes of the Muslim world, Islamic populations. While, as yet, they attend only as observers, Iran and also Pakistan are seeking to join the new Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, which, though not yet officially a mutual defense organization similar to NATO, has nonetheless already envisaged conducting joint military operations. While China has said that no new decisions on membership are immediately pending, Russian President Vladimir Putin suggested that the alliance form an energy club, but offered no details in public sessions. Clearly, this is far from the end of the matter. Excerpt: the SCO's influence in the region is on the rise. A stronger SCO, particularly one with a military component and Iran as a full member, might serve as a check to U.S. interests and ambitions in the region. An expanded SCO would control a large part of the world's oil and gas reserves and nuclear arsenal. David Wall, an expert on the region at the University of Cambridge's East Asia Institute, told the Washington Times, "It would be essentially an OPEC with bombs." Has U.S. policy toward Iran been serving its own imperial interests then, or actually and unnecessarily pushing Iran into the arms of its former and future rivals? It is important to stress that except for the Israeli lobby in the U.S. and its grassroots Jewish American supporters and allies among the Conference of Presidents of major Jewish organizations, there are no other organized lobbies pressuring for this war. Sadly, neither has there been significant domestic resistance to it. The ritualistic denunciations of big oil, whenever there is a Middle East conflict involving the U.S. in this instance, is a totally bogus issue, lacking any substance. All the evidence is to the contrary. Big oil is opposed to any conflicts that will upset their first major entry into Middle Eastern oil fields since they were nationalized in the 1970s. The only identifiable organized political force that has successfully made deep inroads in the U.S. Congress and its sectors of the executive branch are the pro-Israel lobbies and PACs. The major proponents of a confrontationist policy in the executive branch are led by pro-Israel neoconservative National Security Council member and presidentially pardoned felon Elliott Abrams, in charge of Middle East policy, and Vice President Cheney. The principal opposition is found in the major military services among commanders who clearly see the disastrous strategic consequences for the U.S. military forces and sectors of the State Department and CIA, who are certainly aware of the disastrous consequences for the U.S. of supporting Israel's quest for uncontested regional supremacy. Doubt has extended to those whose support might once have been assumed, analysts at the right-wing Heritage Foundation, and leadership elements within the Iranian exile community. The problem is that there is no political leadership to oppose the pro-Israel war lobby within Congress or even in civil society. There are few, if any, influential organized lobbies challenging the pro-war Israel lobby, either from the perspective of working for coexistence in the Middle East or even defending U.S. national interests when they diverge from those of Israel. Although numerous former diplomats, generals, intelligence officials, reformed Jews, retired national security advisors, and State Department professionals have publicly denounced the Iran war agenda and even criticized the Israeli first lobbies, their newspaper ads and media interviews have not been backed in any national political organization that can compete for influence in the White House and Congress. As we draw closer to a major confrontation with Iran and Israeli officials set short-term deadlines for igniting a Middle East conflagration, it seems that we are doomed to learn from future catastrophic losses that Americans must organize to defeat political lobbies based on overseas allegiances.